Okay, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar on deception and NIST and US federal guidelines. I trust and I hope that wherever you are in the world, that you and your family are safe and healthy during these tough times, and wishing you continued health going forward. My name is Jason Silverman. I'm on the product marketing team at Illusive Networks. I'm not going to be presenting today. I'm going to hand things over to Michael St. Cross in a second. But just before we do that, a few announcements, one of which is today's webinar is being recorded, and all people who registered will receive a copy of the recording via email in the next couple of days. You'll also receive a link to a full white paper that we produced about a bit of the topic of today's webinar, specifically how Illusive maps to the NIST federal guidelines. Secondly, the webinars are all the more better when there are questions from the audience. We do always appreciate that. The way you can ask questions is in the Q&A tab on the webinar control panel. And we will reserve time for questions toward the end of today's session. So with all that said, I'm going to turn things over now to Mike. Mike St. Cross, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jason. Well, I appreciate everybody joining today. And again, the agenda we'll cover will touch on the federal guidelines that are driving the requirements for deception, delve into cyber resilience and how that's impacting the advanced persistent threat. And finally, we'll cover some of the elusive capability approaches that are applicable, to the control implementations, as well as the ongoing cyber defensive capabilities that are, now required. And my colleague Rick Tomlin is also supporting the webinar today, and he'll getting into more of the technical details. So getting right into it, we do have new guidelines, and they're really driven by advanced persistent threat attacks and exploits against the U.S. federal government domain, .mil and .gov, and there's millions of attacks daily, and there's certainly a history of major exploits and breaches. And most recently, even in today's news with APT 29, Cozy Bear really targeting vaccine research data. So there's definitely a driver for new requirements. And over the past, I'd say 3 or 4 years, a lot of content development has gone into standards like NIST 800-160 Volume 2, which was published finally in November, delving into cyber resiliency and secondary effects. And what was interesting with that publication is it was already anticipating the NIST 800-53 R5 control set, which finally went into draft mode in March, which is now been draft is closed. It's in final adjudication, and we expect that to be out by the end of the summer, August-September timeframe, and that will impact the 853A and B updates that are soon to follow. Another thing that's really occurred, in 2020 with standardization that again is related to the 853 R5 control base is the DoD Cybersecurity Maturity Model. And that's, represented in the NIST publication 800-171B, and now further reinforced with the supplemental controls guidance for protecting controlled unclassified information, which is 800-172, and that draft is published in July. So this body of work is very tightly integrated, and the concepts for cyber resilience that are shared across these, cyber resilience essentially has, techniques and then design principles. At a high level, there's 14 different techniques. Deception is one of those. We'll focus on that today, but adaptive response, analytic monitoring, contextual awareness, dynamic positioning. There's many key concepts that are really augmenting or supplementing the primary effects that have been required, to date, to secure federal networks. Finally, the NIST Trusted Internet Connection 3.0 program, they published their security capabilities handbook in January. That's also requiring deception to protect against advanced persistent threats. So, this is an emerging topic, but it's finally solidifying as a requirement moving forward for FISMA assessment, as well as DoD supply chain compliance. If you're not implementing these things, your eligibility to bid on federal contracts will be limited. At the higher levels, level 4, level 5, and then finally, with the TIC prescription, we also expect CISA to provide additional guidance. So within this, the concepts that are more relevant for the Illusive dialogue are what's laid out in 800-160R2 and 800-172. So in the deception side of things, we want to deceive the adversary. So the malicious actor can be detected. So the concept of deception for early detection is certainly part of the guidance. Deception has been in the marketplace for over 30 years, mainly for analysis, but deception for detection is certainly now emerging as the better mousetrap. Additionally, we want to reduce the attack surface, so there's less things to exploit. And essentially, there's new tactics and techniques and procedures that require, different methodologies to reduce that attack surface. And, DHS did produce a control overlay in 2017 for the protection of high-value assets. And again, there's supplemental guidance for, control sets that do identify and protect the the crown jewels, as they're referred to. So, it's interesting. We put controls in place, and adversaries find ways to go around those controls, as the picture depicts. But really, identifying what controls we have in place to protect high-value assets, how high-value assets can be connected to, and really what is the normal activity between our pathways between those systems, from user endpoint systems to web and application and database and file share tiers. With deception in the cyber resilience definitions, we have decoys in the 853 Systems and Communications Protection Control class. SC26 does call out for the requirement to have decoys, which is really changing the environment to really provide an attractive set of targets for adversaries that are indeed, more along the lines of a honeypot, a honeynet, a deception network, decoy lures, as they're referred to. So that is now part of the 853 control set, as the R5 gets published as the final standard. And we also have, again, SC30 for concealment and misdirection, so that we do have concealment for protecting our high-value assets. And finally, we also have SI20 in the System and Information Integrity Control class that calls out having tainting in the environment. So planting deceptive data, so we have the malicious actor engaging with those data sets. So the implementing the principles of cyber resilience for deception and attack surface reduction really is because you have the key threat vector of lateral movement. You can't accomplish your goal of exfiltrating data or ransomware encrypting repositories unless you achieve lateral movement. You can only do that by gaining privilege in the environment, and you can only do that by living off the land and moving through existing credentials and connections. And again, lateral movement isn't just the only threat factor. We have vertical movement between the cloud and the data center, and also cross-cloud movement now as well. So it really is, this concept of sideways attacks. They're landing one place with the first move, and we need the second move plus, to accomplish the objective. So the elusive view of this is we want to have a life cycle of really reducing that attack surface that's preemptive. We also want to have laying that baseline of detection with decoy artifacts on systems, as well as full operating system decoys and emulations. And finally, when we do have interaction with a decoy, that is a 100% positive interaction, because you can't interact with these decoys unless you're behaving maliciously, either breaking corporate policy, agency policy, and then we're collecting the forensics of that interaction in a very low-level detail, but in a very quick, sub-second manner. So we do have high fidelity alerts, and really an approach that scales and is really low maintenance. And Rick will touch more on that technical capabilities in the next few slides. The system overall, as I mentioned, we have the attack surface manager on the preemptive side, and that really is cleaning up exploitable connections and credentials, which we'll talk about in more detail. We also have the attack deception system, and one approach here is for the early detection. We're creating low interaction decoys on endpoints that are deceptive credentials and connections. Those credentials are living in caches, Windows LSAS cache, browser database, other SSH caches. But essentially, those credentials and decoys need to be interacted with, so they're supported by a concept of a trap server that represents the connections between the systems that are deceptive, and that again give us that 100% positive detection of movement. But we also have the traditional full OS decoys, as well as standalone decoys to create golden images and have honey networks or deception networks that adversaries can reach maybe in the DMZ or a data center. We can also emulate the environment, including printers, cameras, environment specific IoT or OT type of devices. So that's really the broader view of the product suite. And then when we look at the controls that we're really mapping to, which again will be available in the white paper, the tech brief, there's essentially the critical controls for APT protection referenced in 853R5 with that supplemental 160 version 2 content. You can see I mentioned earlier SC26 and SC30 and SI20 for tainting, because those are kind of the new ones. But the concepts and principles are also addressed in the access management or audit control classes, incident response, and again we have that fully detailed in the follow-up content. Similarly, for the high value asset protection, we're mapping to 19 out of 44 controls, but again these have more broader focus, not just on the deception side, but on the principles of cleaning up the attack surface and identifying the crown jewels and the access to those systems. So with that, I'm going to turn the dialogue over to Mr. Tomlin, and he can dive into a bit more on the capability side.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So, as Mike mentioned before, we'll go to the next slide here. So, as Mike mentioned, we're talking, first and foremost about, preempt. Go out and identify within the environment by introspecting the different endpoints where there are credentials and connections that would lead to, attack pathways to be able to move sideways within the environment. such that an attacker can leverage that to get to the crown jewels or high value assets. And then once those have been identified, so first and foremost, understand the risk that you currently have with your attack surface. But then once identified, then take that that attack surface and clean it up. Basically remove as much of that of those connections and credentials out of the environment as you can, so that they can't be leveraged by an attacker in an attempt to move laterally in the environment. Living off the land is generally the preferred method for an attacker once they've landed in an environment. To leverage what they can find on the different endpoints to enable them to move in the environment. So by denying them that food, basically, instilling hygiene in the environment, you make it much more difficult for them to, be able to move in that and leverage the information. So moving on, so we've got, first and foremost, preempt. But once you've cleaned that, the environment up as best you can, then a second step, basically detect. So what we're doing in the environment is we're distorting the attacker's viewpoint. And again, we're looking at all of this from the attacker's viewpoint rather than from the defender's viewpoint. And so as a result of that, it gives us a unique perspective in terms of what the attacker is going to see and how we can influence that. And by using deceptions and decoys in that environment, everything that's orange in this particular diagram, we can now distort that viewpoint that the attacker would get. And using an agentless binary to plant this information. So we'll plant the information, the binary then self-dissolves, and there's nothing left behind for the attacker to see. All that's left behind are these different deceptions, but the trick, of course, is to tell a believable story so that the attacker sees this information, believes that it's valid, and attempts to use it when moving sideways within the environment. The nice thing about this is that it takes the onus off of the defender, that the defender always has to be right in terms of, especially with behavior analytics and things like that, where you always have to be right. You always have to catch the technique that the attacker is using. It flips that script, and now the attacker always has to be right. So think of it almost as a minefield. If the attacker has to cross a field that has mines in it, then the attacker has to be right in every step they take as they cross that field. And we are basically, using these deceptions to implement that particular viewpoint. So, in the diagram here, so we've got, if an attacker lands on that particular point and they attempt to move laterally, as shown here, we'll detect that move, lateral move attempt, and then that will take us into the next step here, which is respond. When that attacker takes that move, we're notified, and we have a second executable that we can send down. Again, it's a self-dissolving binary that can be sent down, and it introspects the endpoint that the attacker is operating on. And that's a little different than the traditional honeypot method, where you're watching the server that the attacker is interacting with. In this case, we're looking at the endpoint that the attacker is actually operating within, and we're gathering forensics from that endpoint. So effectively putting the response team in the room with the attacker. They're looking over the attacker's shoulder and seeing what the attacker's doing. The result then is that this cuts down, because we can provide that detailed view of the attacker's activity. It cuts down on the response time for the incident response team, in terms of being able to get this detail and determine the appropriate course of action. And so we've seen, customers report, it says there, 60 to 90% reduction in the incident response analyst investigation time for then determining how they're going to respond to the reported incident. So moving on. So, to kind of sum this up, what we're doing is a more effective approach for the broader control coverage. Not only are we using, we are approaching it and making every endpoint a sensor. So it's a different approach than the traditional honeypot. So you've got an environment where now every endpoint is capable of detecting the sideways or lateral movement that the attacker is going to attempt in that environment. First move, second move, they are caught because they have to decide correctly. They have to make the correct decision every time as they're moving through. The other piece to this is that a lot of times honeypots and similar types of deceptive technology are relatively easy to discover. There's automated tools out there. There are telltale signs that often indicate that an attacker has landed on a honeypot, and as a result, they will avoid interacting with it, or they may throw their own type of deception. They may do some things to throw off the defenders. Meanwhile, they are operating elsewhere undiscovered. And the idea here is that with not having an agent on any of the endpoints, A, it's much easier to manage, but B, also, there's nothing to give away the game to the attacker to notify them or alert them that there are deceptions in play, which makes the story that we're telling with those deceptions that much more believable. So, and then finally, I think, especially in the current market, a lot of the tools that have been used in the past have relied on, some concept of normal activity, and in the current environment, there's very little currently that is, is normal and, and something that, normal behavior, normal activity. And so as a result of that, it's much easier for an attacker to, slip through and kind of disguise themselves in the mayhem that is currently going on. Whereas, our approach to this is very definitive. If you leverage the deceptions that we've planted, if you attempt to use this information, because of the way that we have planted that information, effectively, you're not going to, there's no ambiguity about it. If you're using this data, then you have either violated policy and you are an insider that needs to be dealt with, or you are a malicious actor that is using, attack tools and attack techniques to discover this information and then leverage that data. All right, Jason, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Rick. Okay, so just before I make these announcements, just a reminder, we will have time now for questions and answers. You can, if you haven't asked a question already, you can do so in the Q&A tab on the webinar control panel. We have some time if you want to submit a question. Before we get to the questions, just a few next steps you can see on the screen. If you want a comprehensive demo of the of Illusive in action, you can click on the link there. If you want to go to our resources page, you'll find all of our previous webinars and white papers, case studies, and more. You can also read our blog and follow us on social media. Now, I also mentioned, and Mike mentioned this as well, we will send you a copy of this white paper in the follow-up email with the recording. So you can see it in the link on the screen, but we'll send that to you in the email as well. So there is a couple of questions that are already in, so let's get to it. So someone asked, is the decoy an agent running on an endpoint? And if yes, what is the overhead of the agent?
Yeah, I can take that, Jason. So what we're doing first and foremost is we do not have an agent in the environment. The entire environment is agentless. We are deploying a self-dissolving binary that is remotely executed on the endpoint. And as part of its function, it will plant deceptions on that endpoint. Now, deceptions on the endpoint are small bits of data. They might be things in the browser history. It might be a cache connection information in, say, in an RDP client. It could be credential information planted in the LSAS cache or planted in in a client cache as well. But there's very small bits of data. The client, the binary typically runs in about 500 milliseconds. So very lightweight, designed to be lightweight, designed to be there and gone without the end user ever having any idea that that there was a binary running on their system.
Great. Another question we received was, how much infrastructure is tied up with the deception, or is everything software defined? What if we have a relatively small number of endpoints?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, the short answer is with the deception environment, you've got two core servers. You've got our management server and our trap server. And as a result of that, when we plant deception, the management server is handling the user interface, and it is, we're talking, laptop, class type of hardware here. We're not talking anything large, especially in a smaller environment. Obviously, it would scale for larger environments. But in that particular instance, that's running the user interface, it's running the logic, and then you've got a trap server, which is answering all those deceptions that we planted. And again, it's small, it's laptop class hardware as well, and it's basically going to be listening on the various IPs and various ports based on the deceptions that have been planted. And when folks attempt to interact with that, attacker attempts to interact with it, then it notifies the management server, and that triggers the forensics capability that we talked about earlier.
Okay. Another question was, we already use an EDR, endpoint detection and response solution for our endpoint threat detection and forensics. What does deception add to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, endpoint detection, typically is looking at a variety of things. One of them being user behavior, things in that nature. They're also, and so, in this environment, a couple of things. Attackers have become very good at avoiding endpoint protection. Nation state and other very sophisticated attackers, they typically have all of the EDR in their labs, and they are looking at, how can I get around this? And once they find a way around it, then they use that approach. What we're doing is basically something that is hidden to them in terms of they don't know what's real and what's not. And so at some point they have to make a decision about where they move next. And we're putting all of these deceptions in the, and I'll use the air quotes, normal places that they would typically find that. And then, when they have that, then there's no reason for them to not believe that those connection and credential data aren't real. And they will attempt to leverage them over time.
Okay, some more questions are coming in. Somebody asked, does the Illusive platform support remote workers who are using their own devices for work?
Yeah, so you kind of break up there, Jason, but I think it was, the question was, does it support bringing your own device, like for remote workers?
Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. So there's a couple of ways to approach that. The answer is yes. We can have that, especially, but this is primarily geared towards endpoints. So, workstations, laptops, things of that nature, not so much mobile devices. That said, usually if that's the jumping off point, we really don't, it's not a question of how they got into the environment. It's when they attempt to move. So even if they came in on on a mobile device, eventually they're going to have to move to something a little more interesting. And that's when the technology is going to be come into play in terms of capturing them from a deceptive point of view as they attempt to make that second or third move in the environment. Again, looking for the more interesting data, at least interesting to them.
Okay. Another question we received was, do you have any deception technology services that can run on a web server running multiple WordPress blog and websites to detect intrusion and privilege escalation?
Yeah, so I mean, absolutely, especially again, it depends on how that architecture is set up. But certainly, in that environment, again, we're agnostic. And this is one of the keys to it. We're agnostic to the technologies that you're running in terms of whether it's WordPress or whether it's Tomcat or, what have you. Because again, we're looking at it from the OS point of view. And what we're doing is on those endpoints. So, web servers, as an example, we have a number of deceptions that we can, place for those, for an attacker that, would be enticing for them to interact with. And, that is what detects, that interaction is what is going to detect their presence in the environment. So there's ways to, implement deceptions in that to be able to, properly protect that, regardless of what technology you're using.
Okay. Do the manager and trap systems need to be on span ports?
No.
Okay.
That's the short answer. Yeah, no, the trap server typically has multiple NICs in the environment so that you can have a variety of IPs, and then in larger environments you'll have multiple trap servers potentially, just to increase the variety of different deceptions that you can deploy.
Okay. Great. Since each action is governed by intentions, how and who determines when there has been an actual attack?
I think the trick there is it's not governed by yes, it's governed by the intention, but ultimately it's governed by them not just gathering the data. That's one thing, and we're not watching them gather the data per se. It's when they leverage the data they gathered. So if they were able to use, and I'll use an example, they brought in Mimikatz and they harvested credentials from the LSAS cache or wherever, and they now have a set of harvested credentials. That won't necessarily trigger the detection, but what will is if they attempt to either use one of the deceptive credentials that we've planted, so the actual using of that data, that's whether it's the deceptive credentials, or if they are attempting to use one of those harvested credentials to access one of our deceptive servers. At that point in time, any attempt to use or interact with any of those deceptions is what will trigger that. And at that point in time, hey, there's no defending the fact that you're going places you shouldn't be, potentially using credentials you shouldn't have. So from an insider point of view, it's very hard for someone to defend that as I didn't mean to do that. It's very hard for them because they had to have taken certain actions in order to have uncovered the deceptions. And the forensics that we retrieve from that endpoint provide us with a very detailed look at what was going on their endpoint, including things like PowerShell history, what tools they've installed, what files they've accessed. So if they ran Mimikatz, we'll see that. and we'll have that detail that can then be used for the investigation.
Okay, looks like we have, firstly, I think that answered a different question that we had about how does it work that legitimate users don't see the deceptive data? I think you discussed it like in the, insiders, and that they need to do certain things to,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
The short version of that, Jason, is that that's part of both the art and the science of creating these deceptions and planting them. Because we're approaching this from the viewpoint of an attacker, we deeply understand, our engineering team deeply understands how the attacker works, what techniques they use, and as a result, they leverage that knowledge to be able to plant deceptions in a way that the attacker will see them using common attack techniques. But then, like I said, the art and the science of it is also then hiding it from the standard users on these endpoints so that you don't have a lot of false positives, a lot of users tripping over these things.
Okay. There's a question, I'm not sure if I understand what it means, but there's a question, what prevents attackers from having Illusive in their labs too?
Yeah. I think that was in response to a comment I made earlier about EDR. So yeah, I mean, they can have that there, but every instance, and here's the real trick here, right? Every instance of Illusive in the world is going to have different deceptive servers, different deceptive users. The is intelligent. It will introspect your environment and then tailor the deceptions to the environment in question. So I can look at 10 different instances of Illusive and have completely different types of deceptions in the environment, types of deceptive users, deceptive servers, because they're all based on the environment that it's installed in. So even if they have it in their lab, all it'll tell them is that the system's pretty good at putting these deceptions in places that they would expect to find that data. And then it actually, in some respects, it might make it harder for the attacker, because now if they know for some way, some reason or other, maybe there's an insider that told them that Illusive is present in an environment, and they've seen this in some other way, then they're now even more hesitant, because they know there's deceptive servers, they know there's deceptive credentials, but they can't tell the difference between what's real and what's deceptive. And that would give an attacker even more pause. Again, going back to the landmines in the field, what's worse, walking across a field and not knowing, or having a great big sign with a skull and crossbones that says minefield, right? So I don't think it's really an issue. Obviously, we try not to give attackers any more information than they already have.
Okay. This is the last question I see for now. But it was talking about getting back to the federal guidelines, that, as mentioned before, deception isn't anything new. We've seen honeypots for years. Why is NIST and other federal guidelines adopting it now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, like it says, honeypots have been around for a while, and one of the things that when you're around for a while is you have a record of efficacy, or in this case, a record of lack of efficacy. Because you're around for a while, that also means that attackers are familiar. So there are now tools such as Honeypot Buster, and others that are automated that can be run and actually look at that data. But they're also, going further down the, into, needing to be out in front of it a little further. The honeypot is only if somebody lands on it and then finds their way to the honeypot, if they've landed on an endpoint and then finds their way to the honeypot. But where the real effectiveness comes in is when you turn every endpoint in your environment into a sensor. And now you have a much higher probability of detecting that the attacker's on the network as they attempt to move, but also being able to detect them earlier in the cycle before they've made lots of moves and gotten to your high value assets. By having all of the endpoints be a sensor for that, you're able to detect them much earlier in their attack process and deal with them before they've gotten to anything that is critical.
All right, I don't think I see any more questions for now, so we'll start to wrap things up. Thank you to everyone for joining today, and thank you to our presenters, Mike St. Cross and Rick Tomlin. We hope that you found the session valuable and informative. A couple of more things just to repeat. One is that you should receive a copy of both the recording and the link to the full white paper in your email, likely tomorrow, but sometime probably by the end of the week. So keep an eye out for that. And I just wanted to say, we're not going through easy times right now in the United States and around the world with the coronavirus. So again, we hope that your family is healthy and that it remains so. So take care of yourselves. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.